Thank you, everyone, for being here and sticking with us until the end. Your reward will be an early finish and an early happy hour. And as one of the longstanding senior fellows here, my name is Mike O'Hanlon with the Defense Center. I want to congratulate all of my colleagues here on stage, all of you who have done so much in your careers and done so much for this forum. As we're letting people filter in, let me just sort of do what is, in a sense, a brief summary of the day and a sign off before we actually have the panel. But I want to say that I was here when Peter Singer and people like Brendan Arena created the FEF Forum. And over the years, my 21 years at Brookings, I've watched a lot of amazing FEFs come through these doors. And I was just thinking, not that the number of stars is equal to the value to the nation, but in the course of those 21 years, we've had Jay Paxton, who's still the Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps, John Whistler, who I believe is still running 3rd MEF, Lori Robinson, head of Pacific Air Forces, and who has spoken as the keynote at this forum previously, Ken Dahl, Lieutenant General Dahl, who's, as many of you know, a very accomplished Army officer. And back in the early day, in the 80s, before I was even here, Don Pilling, former Vice CNO. And so we've just had a lot of great people, and that's just some of the flashier names. We know that we've had amazing talent throughout the ranks and people who have just done so much for us in the think tank environment here at Brookings and elsewhere, like CNAS, like CSIS, the Atlantic Council, many other places, and AEI. We're very grateful for all that the military fellows do for us in their normal jobs, but also in these years of sabbatical. And again, these fora, these FEF fora, have, I think, become just very dynamic and intellectually rich opportunities for the fellows to talk about what they're doing. So without further ado, let me just briefly tell you who's speaking here and what we're going to talk about today. The broad topic is intervention, and that's a good way to shake off your late afternoon sort of sleepies and get fired up. I'm sure you're still all on adrenaline highs after hearing General Allen and Michelle Flournoy, but we're going to keep that spirit going because we're going to have 4 pretty lively presentations, beginning with Russia, winding up in the Arctic, and doing a little bit of theory along the way as well. And we're going to go down just the row here in order. Garrett Campbell is immediately to my right. He's a naval officer and a long-standing pilot and also a person who's got a lot of Pacific experience. But at Brookings this year, he's been doing a lot of thinking and writing about Russia. And you're going to, I think, hear an interesting perspective, not only on what's up today, which Michelle just talked about so wisely, but also a little broader historical take on what's driving Russia and where it's been going. John O'Grady is an Army officer, a field artillery officer, with numerous combat deployments and decorations to his name. And we'll keep on in that same general vein, but again, not with the idea of indiscriminate use of military force in regard to Russia. I was very struck in reading through his notes and abstract by the way he's looking for a nuanced concept of deterrence and the right way to make it effective and credible and focus on what are really core American interests, and he'll have more to say about that in just a moment. Chris McCauley is our Air Force officer here this year at Brookings, and we're thrilled to have him as well, and he's going to be our theorist of the afternoon. So he's when you look at him today, think Thomas Schelling, think whoever your Bernard Brody, and you're going to hear some pretty funky stuff, but some pretty cool stuff, I can promise you. And then anchoring us and batting cleanup, Frances Masello, who is a very distinguished Coast Guard pilot and officer who was flying around dignitaries before she came to Brookings, been a very important head of various Coast Guard flying squadrons, trainer with a number of different kinds of aircraft. And all 4 of these young officers, because they're certainly all young in my eyes, and young in the sense they have a lot more to contribute even after they've done so much. All 4 of them went through their respective service academies. And so without further ado, let me now just turn the baton over to Garrett, and thank you for starting us off.
Thanks. Good afternoon. Just want to first start out with saying thank you to Brookings. This is a very unique forum, and thank you to Brookings for supporting the fellowship. It's been a very wonderful experience because on a daily basis, we really do get access and an opportunity to sit with some of the decision makers who are looking at the challenges, not only for our nation, but for the international community. And thanks, Mike, for mediating today. Over the last 6 months, we've sat in this very room weekly, and we've come to, I have personally come to see how Brookings represents the gold standard in the think tanks. And honestly, when you look at Mike's body of work, you see that he embodies that gold standard. It's an honor to contribute to this dialogue on our nation's defense and security. My comments today on Russia are broadly focused, and it's relative to how Russia uses military intervention post-1990. And what I mean by that is Russia initially started to use military intervention or use of force to consolidate and bring stability to Russia itself. It was to consolidate domestic power. Concurrently, and with a continuing emphasis, it used military intervention within the former Soviet republics to form these, what we now call frozen conflicts, or they have been called for almost a decade. This evolution continued with an almost ability to control that intervention like a rheostat and control and influence the domestic politics, not only in those states, but to temper Western influence and activity as well, and at times actually attempt to thwart it, as we've seen in Georgia and Ukraine. Finally, as Western influence has continued and the color revolutions and then the Arab Spring, Russian military intervention has really reached a level where it's not just being applied to sustain a client state or a strategic partner. It's really being applied to compel a discussion on the realignment of the international system through a renegotiating of some of the underlying security agreements, which by and large have defined European stability over the last 60 years. So Russian military intervention in Georgia and Ukraine are seemingly fairly obvious. They undertook this to realign the geopolitical environment in their favor and to actively thwart or even reverse Western influence. A question about Crimea should be asked, though. Was it enough to elicit a real Western response? I would argue that Crimea in itself was not. And we see today very little or other than condemnation for its annexation. No one is calling for Russia to remove itself from Crimea. Its strategic value has been accepted. So Crimea in itself was not enough to elicit a Western response. Therefore, Russia had to continue. What you actually, I would say, you see with Crimea is a Georgia-like, the potential for a Georgia-like misinterpretation of Russian red lines on the part of NATO and the EU. In Syria, yes, I think it's fairly obvious in the debates that have gone on what the Russians are after and why they went into Syria. They're there to sustain the Assad regime and their strategic foothold in the Mediterranean. However, that strategic access and going into Syria has upended the local and regional balance of power, something that is widely being heralded as Russia's reemergence as a geopolitical player. In that, they are forcing this dialogue, or attempting to force a dialogue that addresses the region, or addresses the international system, the unipolar world. Immediately after their intervention, before they started flying combat operations, Putin took the opportunity to address the UN, and his speech was predicated on grievances associated with a unipolar world and their belief that we need to renegotiate some of these treaties and agreements. A Yalta-like renegotiation was one. If you follow Foreign Minister Lavrov and Prime Minister Medvedev, they've parroted this all along. And you can actually go back further and see that this began well before the invasion of Georgia. And they've called for really a renegotiation of the Helsinki Final Act. And why is this all important? I'll give you 3 reasons why I think this is important for our leadership in this country and in the EU. Recognizing the evolution of the use of Russian military interventionism as it's gone from a domestic tool to induce stability, as well as then stability in its near abroad. It's now become something it is attempting to renegotiate and alter the international system, which has brought peace and stability to Europe for over 60 years. So understanding this and recognizing this evolution helps us anchor it in time, where it is and what it is likely going to focus on next. Because there are red plains, as Chris will address, that in a gray zone that you've heard of. They don't want to go there. The second thing, its results, it's relatively been successful. It has gone uncountered. Yes, sanctions are biting, but they have not really had a significant counter. The forces they've moved have been done in a manner where they've prepared for that, and you've even heard them say immediately afterwards that they're willing to use nuclear force. Well, I'm not sure if that's true or not, but the result of their interventions have been very successful, and because of that, we need to understand that it has become the best and most effective method to achieve the strategic objectives of altering the status quo as they see it. And it should be of no surprise that over the last 4 or 5 years, this has been accompanied by not only a continued military posturing, but in exercising almost on an irrational scale that reinforces what they're trying to impart to us, that they are willing to use military force. The Arctic is a great example of the irrational scale of their military exercising. And finally, the greater implications. This unchecked success up to this point should show us why we are seeing a pressurization in Moldova, fear across the Baltics, Finland and Sweden discussing NATO membership, maybe not officially, but there is much discussion on it. The unmitigated disaster occurring in Syria and in the Middle East, and a conflict brewing potentially with Turkey that could alter much more than I think NATO is willing to want to engage in right now, as well as I mentioned, the Arctic. So those are the greater implications we're seeing, as well as it hasn't gone unnoticed by other adversaries, if we might so call them that. The success of military intervention and it's the fact that presence brings the prize, or presence is the prize, hasn't gone unnoticed by the Chinese. And it is the backdrop of their strategy in the South China Sea of influencing their neighbors and compelling change to the status quo. Now, I'll close with just saying that Russian military intervention has evolved, and there are similarities to the Soviet past or even the Tsarist past. But a bigger issue here with Russian military intervention, as it has evolved currently, is trying to get to understand it while understanding the fundamental differences between how Russia views the world. And let me end with a couple examples. Admiral Stavridis, in a foreign policy article addressing whether we were in a new Cold War, I believe this was last week, at the Munich conference, this is what he said. At the Munich conference this past weekend, the Polish foreign minister was asked one point by a frustrated Russian. Well, what is our part of Europe? Implying that so much of the former Russian zone of influence had become part of NATO and the EU. Without a great deal of thought, the Polish leader simply replied, your part of Europe is Russia. And then coming out of the Munich conference, There was also a good source to understand this fundamental difference that's led to military intervention and how the Russians think. And it was put out by the Euro Council on Foreign Relations. It's a policy memo by Kadri Liik. I'm sorry if I get his name wrong. He specifically states, Russia has a fundamental different view of what constitutes acceptable international behavior and the goals and natural drivers that underpin it. Those two quotes should show you why military intervention is a legitimate course of action for the Russians.
Thank you, Garrett. John, over to you, please.
Okay, I'm going to read off prepared comments, so I apologize, but you give a Irish kid from New York a platform, and I may keep it. So to make sure that doesn't happen. Again, thank you to Brookings. Great event today. Thank you also, Michael, for moderating the panel. It is an honor, in fact, to be here today. And I also want to just go one step further in a public forum and really thank you for the manner in which you responsibly contribute to the dialogue on national security and defense in this nation. Your voice is one of logic and reason, and I can tell you as someone who spent the greater part of his military career at the remote end of policy, many times the very remote end of policy, I personally appreciate your contributions and thank you for your continued service to our nation. My opening comments today broadly focus on whether the U.S. should intervene in Europe, specifically in response to recent Russian irredentist and revisionist military aggression. But perhaps the question is better framed not in terms of whether we should or shouldn't intervene, but rather when and where to intervene, with what tools, why, and to what extent. I'm sure we all agree it is better to intervene before a situation becomes so untenable that the only options remaining for the president and his national security team are bad ones and worse ones. This naturally then pulls us or pushes us towards deterrence. Put more simply, changing the risk-reward calculus of a potential or real adversary such that they elect to act in a manner, such that they elect not to act in a particular manner. This in and of itself makes evaluating the efficacy of deterrence difficult, if not merely impossible. In 1969, Henry Kissinger astutely observed, deterrence is tested negatively by the things which do not happen. But it is never possible to demonstrate why something has not occurred. The longer the peace is maintained, or the more successful deterrence is, the more it furnishes arguments for those who are opposed to the very premise of this policy. So as I think through this and the things I just talked about, I offer two fundamental questions for policymakers and decision makers of this and the incoming administration as they navigate the security challenges and opportunities beyond 2016. I pose questions as my experience informs me it is typically better to ask the bigger questions prior to getting after answering the smaller ones. And so first, spend the intellectual capital determining what we want the United States to stand for. What are our enduring vital national interests? Answering these questions are critical to ensure we keep ourselves out of a strategy-free environment. It provides clarity of purpose, aligns resources and action, assures allies and partners, and deters potential adversaries. We must follow through to protect and achieve these interests in a sustainable and enduring manner. This takes will. Secondly, this facilitates answering the next question, which is when to deter Russia, from what, where, with what tools, and why. The answer cannot be and should not be from everything, everywhere, all the time. That type of response is not sustainable, and more importantly, it squeezes out the opportunities which might organically or otherwise present themselves for collaboration toward common goals. These certainly are not the only questions we should ask ourselves or the administration should ask of itself. They are two essential ones which help frame a strategy going forward as we move into a new security reality in Europe vis-a-vis Russian aggression. The sense I have now is we are at a point where we would be well served to gain some perspective and re-examine the way forward. Our initial reaction to Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and the Russo-Ukraine war in eastern Ukraine indicates our response to assure NATO allies is adequate. There remains healthy dialogue as to whether it is enough to deter Russia from similar acts in her near abroad. Given we have adequately reacted to Russian aggression, we need to think through how best to respond going forward. I look forward to the panel contributing to this dialogue in a meaningful manner, as well as your question and answers, and thank you.
Thank you, Colonel. Chris, over to you.
I'll start out also to echo some of my co-panelists' remarks, to thank Brookings, thank Mike for moderating, thank the fellow panelists up here, as well as the ones we heard from earlier today, and Brendan Areno and the rest of the team that put this event together, did all the logistics and the groundwork to put it together. Thank you. I'm definitely not a great theorist, as Mike alluded to in the beginning, but it is theory that I'll probably discuss a little bit today, so if you feel the need to nod off, I will not be offended. It would be much better rested to hear from Frances. She had better remarks than I will anyway. So I'll start out with strategy. I define strategy as a plan or approach to achieve or obtain continuing advantage. And I see one of the ways to do that in many contexts is to produce opportunities to act, to defend, or to pursue one's interests, and to do so in such a way that you're not going to invite an escalatory response from a competitor, from your adversary, whoever you're dealing with. I say that because, in previous jobs, we sometimes struggled with coming up with particular options to act and defending those options to act in such a way that we could say this wasn't going to invite an escalatory response from an adversary. Because in a lot of cases, especially with the United States, I think being in the position that we are in, we have to be very judicious with how we're going to expend our resources given the plethora and multitude of interests that we have around the world. So we have to be, I think, even more cautious about where we go about and how we act to not invite that escalatory response from somebody. So a colleague of mine and I came up with what we term, and probably have to come up with a better name for this because it's kind of a mouthful, but interest and intensities lead to red plains model, the ITR model for short. And essentially what it's designed to do is to answer the intuitive question of what are their red lines? But because it's three-dimensional, what are their red plains? And that's where what Garrett was talking about earlier in terms of determining what are those trigger points of an adversary's that you do not want to go beyond, because if you do, you're going to invite that escalatory response. And I think we've seen it here in modern times and recent times. Russia and China and some other countries have found that sweet spot of being able to take action and not get that escalatory response, maybe from us or from other people in the world. Sanctions aside, I mean, there's some things that have happened, but they're not necessarily, I wouldn't characterize them as escalatory. So we looked at this model, and the model's still in development. So I'm not necessarily researching the efficacy of the model. What I'm looking at is the core pieces of it. Are the variables, can they be concluded that they are a generic decision-making criteria that can go across players, geographies, states, et cetera? I mean, can you focus in on these particular criteria and utilize them as a framework to decide when and how to act and to what intensity and what level? So I'll briefly get into the components of it and what I found thus far. Try to keep you awake. But essentially, the three main variables, if you will, are organizational distance, geographic distance, and intensity. Organizational distance is the measurement of how closely related the target of the action is to, and I'll call it competitor B. You have competitor A, competitor B's existential nexus. And I define existential nexus as the most important institution or geographic space to a group's continued existence. Geographic distance is similar. It's a measurement of how closely related the target, or how close the target is to B's nexus, competitor B's nexus. And then intensity, which I find the most interesting variable, is the measurement of how intense competitor A's action is to competitor B. And I assume that a universal scale of intensity, no matter the action. But yeah, I think you have to take into account perception. And that's difficult to quantify, obviously, and that's usually the fallacy of most models, is the subjectivity and how you quantify value. But I would argue that for intensity, you have to add in 2 additional multipliers. How competitor B perceives A's status. Is competitor A considered, in competitor B's eyes, to be a status quo power, to be a revisionist power, to be a revolutionary power, that it would affect competitor B's perception of the act? As well as action frequency. If I take an action by itself, may be seen at a certain intensity, but if it's taken in quick succession with other actions, it might take on a different level of intensity in competitor B's eyes. So sorry for the boring theory, but that's essentially what I'm looking at. I'm looking at different case studies to test out those variables to see if they are generic decision-making criteria. So I'm looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis, the conflict between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, and the current Syrian conflict, the use of chemical weapons, and the U.S. response to the use of chemical weapons. I should have said this in the beginning, but I'm assuming that neither party in this competition want to escalate. So that's a key component. I don't think this model would necessarily work if you're confronted with an adversary like ISIS. I don't think it really fits there. I think you also need to assume that both competitor A and B have an existential nexus to be protected. So a group like the hacker group Anonymous, that'd be a very difficult adversary or competitor to apply this model to. And I also think that if you could act up against that red plane, what I would call the competition space between competitor A's plane and competitor B's red plane, the closer you can get to competitor B's red plane, over time will normalize that behavior. Competitor B will become more used to it, and that red plane pulls back closer to his or her existential nexus. So that's it in a nutshell. I look forward to your questions.
And that leads us naturally to the Arctic. I don't know where the Arctic is between these different planes, but Captain Asala, it's over to you to please explain.
Good afternoon. Thanks to Brookings and everyone who helped sponsor and get today's event. Thanks to the audience for attending, and of course, Mike, thank you. Let's get on our ship and head to the land of cooperation, or should I say the ocean of cooperation, in the Arctic. So not talking adversaries in Russia, but there are some tales that will go into that. So I kind of labeled my topic as cooperation in the Arctic. The question I was really trying to explore, what steps can be taken in the Arctic to foster a cooperative culture and coordinated operations? A little bit of background before I begin into my research, which is very basic. My husband called it a book report. But having said that, I'm going to continue. The United States is approaching that midpoint or 2 year of our 2-year chairmanship of the Arctic Council. In April, we'll hit the actual midpoint. The council is comprised of the 8 Arctic nations: Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Sweden, Norway, the Russian Federation, the United States. I read them off so I forget no one. In 2011, the Arctic Council adopted an agreement on cooperation on aeronautical and maritime search and rescue in the Arctic. This agreement established the framework to execute search and rescue. With this overarching cooperative agreement, you really needed a body or a forum that will actually go out and execute or operationalize or actualize this agreement. And that kind of leads me to my research. In October of last year at the Coast Guard Academy, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum was established by the heads of agencies representing Coast Guard functions of the Arctic nations. They signed a joint statement, I should say, with the agency's intent to further develop that multilateral cooperation, Russia included. This is a very unique maritime governance group. The Arctic Coast Guard Forum, as I've stated in their words, is an independent, informal, operationally driven organization to foster safe and secure and environmentally responsible maritime activity in the Arctic. So the forum enables a really great venue for the Arctic nations to build on that cooperation. So they sit at the table. Their first meeting was at the signing in October of 2015 to sit at the table with their counterparts and really work on that common ground with that convening power of these individual agencies. This can be accomplished at the operational level because they're looking at information sharing mechanisms, creating doctrine and operational protocols through regular exercises, and carry out emergency response and combined operations such as search and rescue, oil pollution response, and other environmental stewardship. Like the Arctic Council, there are working groups that are embedded in the forum. One, the Secretariat, which is handling most of their logistics, and then the Combined Operations Group. The Combined Operations Group is where I'm going to focus a little bit more. In June of this year, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum will meet and give Arctic nations an opportunity to review the work of the Combined Operations Group. And the group's effort has been to develop a multilateral common operating guide, so doctrine or a template that is going to help, I don't want to say standardize, but help formalize the response to situations that do require a multinational or a multilateral response. Arctic Zephyr was a U.S.-hosted tabletop exercise that was held in the October timeframe of last year. We had a lot of international participation by some Arctic nations. It was very successful. They kind of highlighted things that they needed to continue to look into. And then this year, the U.S. is hosting Arctic Chinook, which will be an actual exercise for search and rescue. This will help them further refine and test the coordination mechanisms that are under that Arctic SAR agreement. On the horizon is an opportunity to take these lessons learned from the tabletop and actual search and rescue exercises that enables the participants to understand limitations and challenges. And the Arctic Coast Guard Forum has its sights on conducting an actual search and rescue exercise probably in 2017 after the tabletop of this year. Why is this important? With the sailing of the cruise ship vessel Crystal Serenity in August of 2016, which is scheduled to sail from Seward, Alaska to New York City with 1,000 passengers and 600 crew, it's going to be the largest cruise ship that's going to make it through the Northwest Passage. This presents a potential for a large-scale search and rescue case in a very challenging and harsh environment. If all goes well, which hopefully it will, there will be more that will follow. We're probably certain of it. So the focus that I have from a recommendation standpoint, which was hard to, they're doing a great job. I think the forum is a very great venue to really get the operators at the table. But I just kind of mentioned just keeping the common interest, or keep common interest focused. Continue to build that cooperation and coordination with search and rescue with the template, but hopefully we can take this template or doctrine or product and move it to more discussions about traffic separation schemes, environmental stewardship, the International Maritime Organization's Polar Code, all which will increase safety measures and awareness. And the second is it's really a confidence-building mechanism. Working side by side with these Coast Guard counterparts from all the Arctic nations really will enable a culture of trust and interoperability, hopefully to expand search and rescue arena from these tabletop and actual search and rescue exercises into, again, the oil pollution arena, response, ice operations, and potentially fisheries. I'd like to close with a quote from the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard Commandant, Admiral Zimkoff, which quotes best summarizes regards to the establishment of the Coast Guard Arctic Forum. We have an opportunity to make a region that focuses on humanitarian concerns, on environmental concerns, on the way of life of indigenous tribes, and not as a warfighting domain. Those are my comments.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple of questions before we go to you. Actually, I'm going to have one question, just one single question for the three gentlemen closest to me, but I want to begin with a different question for Francis. And again, you laid out a more hopeful way to think about U.S.-Russian relations, and it was a useful contrast. And I think we'd all like to hope this can be where the future is. Let me throw sort of a crazy scenario at you, motivated partly because I recently, like many people, watched The Martian, in which that Chinese booster came to our aid in a future scenario and allowed us to rescue an astronaut from Mars. Now, we don't have many icebreakers in the United States, in the Coast Guard or the Navy, Now, this cruise ship is leaving in August, so that maybe improves the odds of not running into getting stuck in the ice. But let's say that in some future scenario, somebody does get stuck in the ice. Are we going to need Russian help to get out? And depending on where a disaster might occur in the Arctic region, is it going to require basically everybody's best capacities to have a chance? If it's a large enough scale, are we really going to have to work together? Or is there one country that's just overwhelmingly positioned to do it? Probably, I'm guessing, Russia.
Right.
But how would you respond to sort of a scenario like that? I mean, first of all, is there much of a chance of really U.S.-Russian cooperation, U.S.-Russian, Canadian, Finnish, Norwegian cooperation? And then secondly, is Russia far and away the dominant player in the Arctic today in terms of capacity to quickly surge?
Start off with but I would say obviously Russia is. I mean, they've got the icebreakers to support it. They've got the infrastructure more than we have. The United States Coast Guard has one medium endurance icebreaker for the Arctic, and the heavy icebreaker is down supporting McMurdo Station in Antarctica. So, depending on the time of year that a boat or person got stuck, would really essentially and what sector in this agreement that they fell into. But if the United States is there to respond and we can't break the ice because the medium endurance is not going to be able to break through really thick ice, we're going to have to call our counterparts. We're going to have to call another nation to say, hey, come help us. Has that happened? It already has happened even with regards to search and rescue. The Russians have called us to help support Canadians as well. So as long as we cooperate and understand those limitations, and I think as you take these search and rescue exercises, it will kind of show everyone the limitations and everyone's capabilities of who might have the actual resources to execute this, especially in the oil pollution and response world.
Do you think we over-depend right now on foreign help, be it Russian or anybody else's, or do we have enough capacity if we think of this as a five-nation consortium?
I mean, if you look at it, we have the same number of icebreakers as China, and they're not in the Arctic Ocean. So I think with some priorities, the president has come forth and said, hey, we're going to get move direction of getting some icebreakers. I think that will help us. But there's one vein of the maritime community. It's the safety of life at sea. So I feel very strongly that people will participate and want to be cooperative if the situation does prevail that you kind of laid out there, just like in space. People will want to come to the aid of others. It's that mariner's law.
That's a hopeful thing, even if we need to ask questions about whether we do have enough of the right capacities. Gentlemen, listening to you, I heard nuance in what all of you said, which I find very encouraging. And it's something we're looking for in Russia policy. So I'm drawing out this question long enough to give you each a chance to figure out how to save your career if you want to answer it in a public session, because you chose a sensitive topic. And so in a way, you got yourselves into this boat. And I'm just going to put you on the spot to the extent you want to answer and say, what do we need to consider doing next in our Russia policy that we're not doing now? And the reason I put it that way is not to ask you to second guess what President Obama is doing today, but to maybe counsel, let's say, the broader strategic community, the broader debate. What should we be thinking ahead to for a year, 2 years, 3 years from now? Because again, with the nuance I heard from the three of you, and I think that's a fair way to summarize to some extent what you each said, you're all concerned about Russian behavior, but none of you want to necessarily make Eastern Ukraine the showdown locale for a great World War III battle, at least not from what I heard. So to what extent does President Obama basically have it about right? He's put on some sanctions. He's got the European Reassurance Initiative kicking into a higher gear with the fiscal 2017 budget request, roughly quadrupling the U.S. money we would spend on infrastructure and rotations in Eastern Europe. But he's otherwise being a lot more patient than some more hawkish people have counseled. Even a very moderate Democratic voice, Michelle Flournoy and Strobe Talbot, have argued for arming the Ukrainian military directly. President Obama hasn't done that. I'm not necessarily, again, I'm drawing this out long enough to give you a chance to think of how you want to answer without getting into too much trouble, but I'm not necessarily asking you to take positions on each of these things specifically, but what's the next broad kind of our national policy that we need to consider consistent with your earlier theoretical or historical perspectives that we really need to at least think about, to at least get on the table as a country to maybe help the next president think about where we want to be in a year or two? Garrett, you want to start with that?
Well, one of the things when you start to look at what the Russians have done over the last 10 years and the success of their different interventions, military interventions, and the fact we really have never not military countered them. We debated weapons to Ukraine, and very much so here at Brookings. One of the things I've looked at extensively as I've tried not to be so negative about we are in a showdown with them, and I don't believe that. But one of the things you cannot dismiss, I would ask you to go look, just Google Soviet negotiating style, and you will find, or in Russian negotiating style, you will find how they negotiate oil contracts and how they go about negotiating their foreign policy. They very much have a culture, from what I can tell, where negotiations are distributive. Win, lose, zero sum. And speaking with Steve Pfeiffer on nuclear proliferation, there's some of that throughout the 80s that we saw too. We had to get past that. We'll have to get past it again. But where I'm going is having a ceasefire in Syria with no appreciable penalty when it is violated does us no good, because in their negotiating style, that type of compromise is viewed definitively as weakness.
Thank you. So that's more of a warning about where we could be in the coming weeks.
I think what we're seeing, and if you don't want to admit there's a proxy war going on in Syria, that's fine. There's a proxy war going on in Syria. And we need to think about how we manage that without getting dragged in. Because I think the last thing we want to see is the Saudis provide anti-aircraft weapons to someone. That would be bad.
John.
So I think the first thing I would do is look a little to history and what has at least worked to some extent in the past. And that's why a lot of my initial comments use the word or term deterrence. It can't be necessarily deterrence of the past, right? So when you think about deterrence, you have either threat by punishment or threat by denial. But this whole notion of deterrence, quite frankly, has taken about a 20-year hiatus. And it hasn't really been until recent Russian aggression that people like myself and others have started to go back and dust off the books and really look into this and say, how might we apply it in today's current geostrategic environment? And I'll keep my comments specific mainly to the Russia and the European theater. And so, again, you've got threat by punishment or deterrence through punishment and deterrence through denial are two commonly agreed upon terms. There's one that also presupposes a sense of rationality, has to exist in order for deterrence to work. But history is replete with deterrence failing. Okay, you could look at Japan's attack on the U.S. Clearly, they viewed us as militarily superior. They realized they had to try to get the death blow in and then kind of sue for peace, and that didn't quite work, and we saw how that turned out. You've got 1973 with Syria and Egypt attacking Israel. Another probably example of failed deterrence where a military balance wasn't necessarily matched. And you've got to ask yourself, well, why is that? And there's a certain amount of interests that need to be thought through as well. So it's more than just purely a military balance. It has to look at components of interests. And that's where it really starts getting interesting, especially with Russia today. So when you look at going forward, the multiple downdrafts that are putting negative pressure on Russia as a national power, economics, demographics, and I could go on and on. I won't bore you with the list. Many of you are aware of them. That puts Russia in a position where their internal risk-reward calculus perhaps begins to change in such a manner that a rational person wouldn't possibly consider a drive into the Baltics. But an irrational actor might do that. And so what we have to do is strike a balance between showing strength, but not boxing Russia into a corner where that risk-reward calculus and what they believe they have to lose instead of gain gets so out of whack that it causes them to act. And the last thing I would offer is Glenn Snyder, I think it was in 1961, he talks about the stability-instability paradox. And so some of our response, like you talked about, ERI and some other things, has been good, and others are asking for a stronger response. And to do so may be appropriate, but what it also then does is it pushes, it reduces the risk of the low probability, high risk scenario of, Article 5 aggression, all on war, and it pushes more towards this gray warfare. And then, so now how do we deal with that? And the last thing I would say is I would offer a new phrase, maybe not new, but deterrence through resilience. And creating resilience in places where it's most likely to have effect in terms of Russian hybrid or new generation warfare. So those are some of the broad things we need to be thinking through as we look forward to the future, how we react and they might respond.
Thank you. Chris, any thoughts on that?
No comment? No, I'm just kidding. I think I would say, with the new administration coming in, first thing, obviously, I think is to define what their core interests are. Do they remain the same for the United States in a new administration as they have been? So once you've answered that question, then I think you need to answer the question of whether you want to escalate or not with Russia, and to utilize, what I've researched. If you don't want to escalate, which I think is kind of where we are right now, we don't want things to escalate, be out of control, then you might be able to apply some of the principles from this research to determine where, when, and how you would take action to, I think, get to something that you mentioned about reestablishing deterrence. Picking and choosing where you can act to show willingness to act, to show that you have credibility and capacity to do so, will allow you to strengthen your deterrence and rebuild that and have a little bit more behind that. But absent that, I don't see, our fundamental interests would advocate for an escalatory response or an escalatory position. I think, I think the approach that the Obama administration has taken thus far, I think, is pretty good. I think we could do a few more things, but I don't think we want to go to the point where it's going to escalate the situation.
Thank you. Well, let's go to you. We've got about 15 minutes. We'll take 3 questions at a time, if you don't mind. And if you want to direct one of them to a specific panelist, that's great, or you can make it more general. We'll start here with the gentleman in the 6th row. We'll take this half of the room first because I saw 3 hands, and then we'll work over here in round 2.
Great, thanks. Steve Horrell, I'm the Navy Fellow at the Atlantic Council. I'll join the thanks for this great forum today. So my question, it starts with Garrett's great depiction of Russia's willingness to use force, goes into some of the things I think that the other 2 gentlemen were saying about both the deterrence and then escalation. There's a frequently expressed assumption that NATO Article 5 has some sort of absolute deterrent power. I'd submit that's an assumption that needs a lot of hard looking. So I'd invite, kind of a general comments on the value of that assumption, but also does the force level within ERI play into that, and or the more theoretical pieces about the moving red planes go into that?
Thank you. And let's go over here and then up to Barry in the front after that.
Thanks. Toby Harshaw from Bloomberg View, yet again. Along the same line, I wanted to ask you about the Baltics, particularly the colonel and the commander. General Allen said earlier that he views that as a NATO problem, but I think the rest of us and the people who actually live in the Baltics look at it as a U.S. problem. I'm wondering what specifically you think we should do to better deter any Russian adventurism. In particular, do you think we should stop rotating troops in and actually have a permanent presence there, even if it violates the 1997 agreement?
Thank you, Toby. And finally up to Barry. Then we'll go to all of you.
And ladies and gentlemen, fantastic. Thank you all for all your efforts. I had 2 questions, actually, one for Garrett, but it looks like he's covered. So I'd like to turn to Chris. Chris, I was struck by Francis's somewhat more optimistic view of the overall relationship. And my question to you is, does your model incorporate or is it flexible enough to incorporate, either in the discussion of interest, intensity, or distance, areas where the bilateral relationship is complex, has areas of both competition and cooperation? Is that a mitigating factor that you work in somehow? And secondly, is your model able to address the complexity of multilateral coalition or alliance warfare? Do you view that as one block when you're lining up the sides, or do you take into account instances where the various members of a coalition on one side may have competing interests, could be split off based on their intensities, and so forth?
Great. Why don't we start with that? Over to you, Chris, because you got a specific question, and then we'll work the rest of the group.
Well, I think when we initially designed the model, that was one of the weaknesses in terms of, it's almost set up to view the relationship in a vacuum between competitor A and B, when we know that every situation is much more complex, has more players involved. But I think what we found is that as you run the model over and over again, you can incorporate additional players into that to approximate their red plane as well, so that you can account for their interests that may vary if you're talking about a coalition scenario, where their interests may vary a little bit. And I kind of view it as if you're in a four-walled room, you have competitor A in one corner, competitor B in another corner. That corner is their existential nexus. You have the organizational and geographic distance variables coming off from that point, and then the intensity coming up the wall towards the ceiling. Same thing for your competitor. Well, you could add other players in the other corners of the room to get a better picture of reality. But as all models are, there's weak points in it, and that may end up being a weak point because or a failure of the model, if you will, if we can't account for multiple players. But I think that's where we're trying to go with it. We're not there yet. I mean, there's a lot of math that has to be done, a lot of wargaming, if you will, plugging in information you're still approximating somebody else's response. So you're trying to figure that out. So you're trying to put yourself in their shoes, which is, as we all know, very difficult. Not being that person, not growing up in that culture, that society, being able to do that. I mean, there's history is replete with, times when those mistakes were made because we weren't able to do that appropriately.
Why don't we go to Francis next before coming over here on some of the other questions, but you can handle any you might wish. But I'm curious because we're asking about multi-agent interactions, and you've got 5.
Right.
Do you see any potential, positive dynamics that can ensue when you have multiple players in a cooperative environment or endeavor?
I mean, hopefully. I mean, with regards to the model you're talking about, we talked a little bit before about having other pieces and maybe some good scenarios, kind of incorporated into the model just to have some baseline that cooperation can occur. Maybe it's bilateral in the beginning, and then it can stretch to multilateral, because I think that's what you're seeing, at least in the Arctic for now.
John, there's some talk of Article 5 and its significance about forward rotations in the Baltic states, or whether we should have permanent presence. Any thoughts on any of those matters?
Yep, so with that, I didn't hear General Allen's specific comment, but stated as you put it, I would agree. It's a NATO problem. The U.S. is a member of NATO, and therefore it's an extension. It's our problem, just like it is every other one of the contributing members. And so in the interest of time, I'll leave it kind of there with that question. In terms of the Baltics itself, being a NATO problem, again, U.S. problem, and what things might we better do? Again, I think my sense is the things we have in place and the movement that we have right now with ERI, build up over the fight up, pre-positioning of forces, increased air policing, increased naval exercises, and we're not the only ones doing it. The European nations as well, NATO nations, I should say specifically, are also contributing to that in a very meaningful way. My sense is the response is about right for the current context and needs to constantly be monitored and calibrated accordingly. But what we could better do, and it goes back again to Mr. Snyder's stability-instability paradox, if we've now, through our actions, let's assume we've effectively deterred Russia, changed our risk-reward calculus such that they don't try to attempt similar things in NATO countries, then what is the next likely action for them to achieve certain interests? And that's where we get into the gray war. And I would say there are things that we absolutely can do, and it's clearly far more out of the military realm, but things like civil society, right? Law enforcement, intelligence, border policing, education, economic, things that are going to deter that gray zone type of subversion, info warfare, economic, hostage at times, and make it deterrence through resilience. And that is an area that I think has a lot of opportunity that we've just yet to begin to even talk about. I hope that answers your question.
Garrett.
Yeah, I think you nail it. For me, when I look at the Baltics, sure, there's a lot of pressurization on the Baltics, but I think Article 5 really does come into play in a way that it unifies much of NATO, and the Russians know that. Where you really, I think, should be fearful with Article 5 is Turkey. The Russians want a go. I think Putin's made it clear there was a personal vendetta with Erdogan over the shoot-down of that jet and other things. So if you talk to NATO members or EU members, the last thing they want is a discussion or a forced discussion over Article 5 and defending Turkey. So when Article 5 is applied in the Baltics, I think it's much more a sound case that it will be honored. But Turkey, I think, is a different issue. Another thing I'd like to point out, in looking at a lot of how Russia is intervening and what they're doing, we talk a lot about deterrence. But imagine if you were sitting in a room and they're talking about deterrence. They're deterring us all over the place, and they think they're winning. Just flip the dynamic and look at how they military intervene and go, that's how they're deterring us. We're not looking at it that way. And through that deterrence, they're then going, well, we need to renegotiate some of these treaties. And that, if that is their larger strategic objectives, that's a problem. Because I don't think we have the ability to do that.
Okay, so the north side of the room did great. Let's go to the southern side of the room for the final round of questions, and I see 3 hands, so this is perfect, and then we'll just wrap up.
Hello, Commander Greg Smith, a fellow up at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. I want to congratulate all of you for taking a big swing at a complex topic. I stayed away from that and got into some of the physics side of autonomy and machines. Safer topic.
Sounds easy.
But the question is, how do you make room for Russia, or China for that matter, and preserve the world order?
Okay, well stated.
My name is Dimitri. Thank you. Very interesting. I'm an independent. For my comment question is for Commander Campbell. Thank you. Very interesting presentation. Quick comment. I appreciated that you qualified your statement about peace and stability the last 60 years, and you said it was for Europe. And I think I hear a lot of people say in the last 20 years or whatever, since the fall of since the end of the Cold War, we've had peace and stability around the world. And I think and now Russia is bringing that to an end. I think the Russian view would disagree with that, and since 2000, we've had a lot of instability, especially in the Middle East. So I appreciate you qualifying that. And then to come back, my question is about your last statement about the different view from Russia. So if you could, you explained a little bit your view on, maybe if you could comment on how you see that view, and also my question is more so, do you think Putin understands what that view is, and he's ready to comply with that view? For example, Lavrov has commented about reforming the Security Council, but he hasn't put forward any complex, straightforward what to do. And if Putin talks about international law, but if they comply with international law, they have to pay UCO's shareholders billions of dollars and respect the ruling of the ICC on the Georgian war. So do you think Putin is ready to accept his own kind of new rules? And how do you see that this different view is seen in Washington? Is there an understanding of it? Thank you.
Well, let's get the last question, and then if you only answer part of that, that's okay too. But I'll begin with you in a second here.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Lauren Hershey, I'm a civilian. I was at the Justice Department. I got a degree in national security policy back in my age 51 in 98. So I think about these things, and you provoked me to ask a very short, simple question. What do you think our vulnerabilities are between now, literally March 1, and let's say January 20th when we're swearing in, or January 21st have sworn in a new president? Who's going to take advantage of this moment in time for the United States? North Korea, China, Russia, name them, ISIS, et cetera. What keeps you up at night on that?
Good. So we'll start with Garrett on the second set of questions and then go to the rest of the panel for the first and third to finish up.
Regarding whether I think Putin is willing to adhere to the rules he wants to set, in some of my research, what you find is there is a very different, we view ethics differently and rules differently. And in the article I cited from the European Council on Foreign Relations, they talk about how the Russians view rules as something, or I'll use the Germans as example because they're an easy one. Germans set rules and they follow rules. No one deviates from the rules. Russians set rules because there need to be rules, but that doesn't mean we follow the rules. There just have to be rules. Okay, I think when you have this collective, small group, what Fiona calls the Stavka, or is labeled the Stavka, this small group of national security experts and former KGB officials who are running the country with not much input from anyone else. That's how they view the world. There are rules, but that doesn't mean we have to follow them. There just have to be rules.
Thank you. John, would you like to try either the is there room for Russia and China in the New World Order, or the rest of 2016 in the danger spots? Why don't you take whichever one of those you most like?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take question number one for 500 then. So, you know, we've got to, and in the interest of time, I will be short. We've got to try to better understand what Russian interests are. And I don't think we do a good job of that, in part because they don't signal that nearly as clearly as we might like. But you could probably say the same thing about us, you know, to the previous point, you know, where you sit is where you stand. But there are spaces and places. And if you read the most recent Russian national military strategy, what I took from that I thought was very interesting is it was almost, I would put it at 80-20. It was 80% inward looking and 20% outward looking. And to me, where we can find maybe the best common ground going forward is figuring out what those interests are, where we can assist in those interests, but we absolutely have to be clear about where we stand, and that's why in my opening comments I talked about we have to figure out what our vital national interests are first. If we don't do that, I don't know how you find common ground in a meaningful way that people can kind of recognize and decipher and anticipate. So we've got to do that as well. So those would be two very broad things to hopefully begin to get at that answer or question.
So Chris and then Francis, Bryce, Harper, Masella in the cleanup role. You can each take whichever of the questions that's there. And we still have the outstanding one about the rest of 2016, so I hope that gets touched on, but as you wish.
I guess to that last question that we haven't touched on yet, I would say yes. I mean, I think there's going to be any number of players that will try to take advantage of what we traditionally call the lame duck part of a presidency. Whether that's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, even allies. I mean, I think it's a great opportunity to leverage an asymmetric opportunity to maybe put some things into play, to take some action that potentially would result in a response from us or escalatory response from the U.S., where in this year it may not, just because there's so much going on. We're so much more inwardly focused on the campaign season and on the election.
Thank you.
If I could on that, that one question. Oh, I
Oh,
apologize.
no, actually, no, I do want her as cleanup, because that's
Yep.
the right person to finish with. So very briefly, and then over to Francis. Francis will have the last word, but you got to briefly.
So this change of administrations is historic. Historic because for the first time, the incoming party, or parties really, so at about convention time, June, July, come 1 June of this year, the two parties, nominees, incoming administrations, now have a congressional mandate to begin at that point in time their transition. Unprecedented access, unprecedented infrastructure to support that process, to be able to begin looking at those types of things, whatever they may believe they are, and start forming the team to say on day one, how are we going to deal with this? And discuss that with their counterparts currently in. That's unprecedented. It's historic, and I hope they both take the opportunity.
So Francis, of all these questions on the table, please, whichever you would like to.
I guess I'll go with question number one and sort of with number three in the back, just to say from my view of the optimistic view, I think keeping engagement open with Russia on those common interests is really critical, because like when you create having the Arctic Council, you keep that venue open for the State Department to still have those conversations with our counterparts that are at the table. And I think that's what makes at least the Arctic Coast Guard Forum very unique. You have Russia at the table having these conversations, and hopefully they spill over into cooperative and coordinated things. The last piece about what would keep me up at night, I know like from a Coast Guard perspective in this forum, these principals are definitely worried about a mass search and rescue case. You have aircraft that transit over the poles, and something goes down in that region. It will be a very large challenge for all players in that arena, with the vast distances, the limited infrastructure, no refueling, no deep sea ports. So that is, I definitely know, will keep them up at night, and it would keep me up at night if I were in charge as well. So thank you for the questions.
I'm going to stop it there. Thank you all very much for what you did, being here today, but also your participation. And please thank the panelists.